Thank you, Mr. Stringer, and it's a pleasure to see you back in your chair for this afternoon's debate, and I'm sure I speak for everyone when we pass on our thanks to the House staff who worked so hard to get Westminster Hall debates back up and running this afternoon. I'd like to thank all colleagues who have contributed to this debate this afternoon and pay tribute to the tens of thousands of people from across the UK who have signed this e-petition, asking that we in this House take the time to consider the plight of the Indian farmer protesters and the very difficult situation that many journalists currently working in India find themselves in. In particular, Mr. Stringer, I'd like to acknowledge the contribution made by my friend, the Honourable Member for Linlithgow and East Falkirk, and thank him for the thoughtful way he opened this debate on behalf of the Petitions Committee. As he correctly said in his opening remarks, these are complex issues, and I think it's important that we reiterate and make clear that in today's debate in the UK Parliament, we have no locus on the merits or otherwise of the agricultural reform bill passed by the Indian Parliament last year. The future of Indian agriculture is a matter entirely for the people of India and their government. And likewise, it is right that the Indian government appropriately enforce law and order, and should protest cross a line into illegality, it is not our place to say that they cannot police that appropriately. But what is undeniable is that in a democracy, the Indian government has an obligation to uphold and defend the rights and freedoms guaranteed to her citizens by the Indian Constitution. And that includes the right to protest and the right to a free press, one which is not subject to harassment, intimidation, violence, or state censorship. So while the internal political matter of agricultural reform is not a matter for this House to discuss, I do believe that on matters concerning international human rights, people outside of India can and indeed should make their voice heard. As my honourable friend for Linlithgow, East and Falkirk said, since the start of these protests, there have been numerous and widespread reports of violence being meted out against protesters, both from the police and government supporting mobs. We've all read the reports from Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, and indeed other human rights organisations, about the beatings and the harassment, the intimidation and the unjustified detention of farmer protesters, which have sadly escalated in recent weeks. Since the tractor rally and the violent clashes on January the 26th, protest leaders have claimed that more than 100 people have gone missing as the Indian government resorts to using laws of sedition in order to clamp down on protest, a move that has prompted the UN High Commission for Human Rights to call on the Indian government to stop, in their words, stop threatening, demonising and arresting peaceful protesters and stop treating them as anti-national or terrorists. And while they were doing that, Amnesty International called for the immediate and unconditional release of activists and others who have been arrested for simply exercising their right to peaceful protest, and for the government to stop the harassment and demonisation of protesters. And in many ways, I'm glad that the UK government has called out the Indian government on this and made their position very clear, and they will continue to champion human rights, and they regard the right to peaceful protest, freedom of speech and a free press to be a vital part of any democracy. Of course, Mr. Stringer, as we heard from so many honourable members this afternoon, including the Right Honourable Member for Islington North, the crackdown against farmer protesters didn't happen in isolation. It was coupled to a raft of draconian measures around the ability of the press to report freely on what was happening. And the Honourable Member for Peterborough was right when he described those clashes of the January the 26th and how the Indian government ordered mobile internet services to be suspended around the Delhi area where the farmer protest was ongoing, claiming that it was to maintain public safety. The move was quickly condemned by campaigners and trade unions who pointed out that under international human rights law, India officials should not use broad, indiscriminate shutdowns to curtail the free flow of information or to harm people's ability to freely assemble or express their political views. A few days after the suspension of those internet services, the government actually ordered Twitter to suspend the account of hundreds of users claiming that they were inciting violence. And a Guardian report afterwards said that those Twitter accounts actually belonged to news websites, activists and actors. And around the same time, as we've heard, 8 journalists who were covering the protests were arrested on what Human Rights Watch have described as utterly baseless criminal charges. With 8 journalists facing criminal charges, including sedition and promoting communal disharmony and making statements prejudicial to national integration, it's right that we as an international community speak out in condemnation. And as the Honourable Member for Nottingham East pointed out, the arrests of the journalist came just before other detentions, including the 22-year-old climate activist Disha Ravi, who was accused by police of being a key conspirator and a formulator and a disseminator of a protest toolkit for farmers. They also indeed claimed that she shared that knowledge with Greta Thunberg. I was struck by the Right Honourable Member for Chipping Barnet when she suggested that what was happening was nothing unusual. I beg to differ, because these draconian clampdowns on press freedoms and individual freedom of expressions have not just been condemned by international organisations such as Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, but a whole raft of journalist groups within India have been unequivocal in their condemnation. The National Union of Journalists in India, the Editors Guild of India, the Press Club of India, the Indian Women Press Corps, the Kashmiri Journalists Association, the Delhi Union of Journalists, the International Federation of Journalists, Reporters Without Borders, and the Indian Journalists Union have all released statements on the crackdown of press freedoms and in support of the journalists covering it. And as we heard, the International Press Institute have taken the matter up directly with the Prime Minister, asking him to intervene. Mr. Stringer, as it said in the opening minutes of this debate, how India wants to organise its agricultural sector is entirely and exclusively a matter for the Indian government and its people. Human rights abuses and the silencing of the press are a matter for us all. As Razat Khosla, the Senior Director of Research of Advocacy and Policy at Amnesty International, said, "We have seen an alarming escalation in the Indian authorities' targeting of anyone who dares to criticise or protest the government's repressive laws and policies. The crushing of dissent leaves little space for people to peacefully exercise their human rights, including the right to freedom of expression, association and peaceful assembly in the country." There has been, Mr. Stringer, an alarming escalation in the Indian authorities' targeting of anyone who dares to criticise or protest against them. So we add our voice to those in the international community and in the domestic organisations calling on the Indian government to immediately stop its crackdown on the protesters, the farmers' leaders and journalists. We want to see the immediate and unconditional release of all of those who have been arrested and detained solely for peacefully exercising their rights to freedom of expression and assembly. The shutting down of the internet, the censoring of social media and the use of draconian laws against protesters and journalists who have been peacefully voicing opposition to the new laws or have been questioning the government's methods must immediately cease. Mr. Stringer, freedom of speech, the right to protest and a free press are the hallmarks of a democratic society. A democracy cannot function if those fundamentals are under attack, being suppressed or are being eroded. Right now, it appears that all is not well in what is the world's largest democracy. And it's up to the Indian government to show its own people and the international community that it wants to protect that democracy and create a country that works for all of its citizens. And I would urge the Indian government to take heed of what's been said here this afternoon and indeed across the world and look at its own actions and act in the benefit of all of its citizens.